So Martin Luther, as that Reformation had begun, had found himself in the castle Wartburg and in hiding, in protection, a place of refuge. God is his refuge, and God was his strength, and God was his very present help in trouble. And the prince of the area had rescued Martin Luther and said, "Go hide in my castle. I'll defend you. And while you're up there, why don't you do something productive?" So Martin Luther starts translating the Bible from Latin and Hebrew and Greek into the German language of his day. And soon after he leaves the castle, soon after things are a little bit calmer, they were never much calmer, one of his first sermons was this sermon based on the gospel that we have today, Luke 18. Not John 8, which is what our Reformation references, but about Luke 18. And he loved that text. His sermon went for about an hour and a half, by the way. If you have great grace, I'll read the whole thing for you. But feel free to Google it, the Pharisee and the Publican, Luke 18. Really, really wonderful story that begins basically by saying, or Martin Luther begins basically by saying, this is an extraordinary story of two people of God. You have the Pharisee on one side, who is saintly and beautiful and bold and keeps all the commandments. And you have a publican, someone who represents the public, a tax collector, a sinner who is good for nothing, basically, on the other side. And he starts with that, and he says, the amazing thing is that they're in the same temple. They are praying to the same God, and yet they are polar opposites. And not only that, but just as that Pharisee lifts himself up, and he says, by the way, it's beautiful. We need more Pharisees in the church. We need more people who tithe and who fast and who pray. It's wonderful. But yet, the judgment of people around that Pharisee is different than the judgment of God. And this tax collector, this publican, who has taken an oath to say there is no God but Caesar, finds himself in the temple. Finds himself in the temple praying to a God that is not Caesar. Praying to a God that maybe this tax collector has heard in the Ten Commandments, who wants us to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves, but who is a jealous God and will punish children up to the 1,000th generation for failing. Maybe that's the God that the tax collector has heard about. But his prayer says something different. His prayer says that he heard about a God that may have some mercy. God's steadfast love and mercy endure forever. And it's that God that tax collector, that sinner, repents and prays to. And then Martin Luther says, God's judgment is completely turned upside down. For that's God's judgment in heaven, that even this sinner is blessed and welcomed and is considered justified. Two men go up to the temple to pray, and one goes home justified. Today, 20 and 2 are in our choir. How many will go home justified? Or 222 are in worship, and how many will go home justified? Or, Jan, 222 will give to the stewardship campaign, not 155. We'll have those intent cards from 222. But how many will go home justified? Prayerfully, everyone who expresses a need, expresses repentance, expresses their sinfulness. Martin Luther goes on to say that he had to preach justification every single sermon because it was the hardest thing. This justification by grace through faith. The end of our Romans text today says something about that God justifies us not by the works of the law, not by how many of the Ten Commandments we've kept, but just by God's own person, by God's own love and mercy. That's how God justifies us. Martin Luther said he had to preach this because it was the hardest thing, not because justification is hard, but because people are hard-hearted and hard-headed and stiff-necked, and we continue to try to elevate ourselves. We continue to put our best face forward to God, to others. We continue to update our resumes to say, hey, look, here's who I am. Maybe if St. Mark's is looking to call another pastor in addition to me, maybe besides me, we'll see. Maybe that pastor or that deacon will probably put on there, here's the things I've done, da-da-da-da-da. They probably won't put on there, St. Mark's, be merciful to me, I'm a sinner, I'm the worst there is. And yet, this is what that story's about. Martin Luther, though, eventually said something about simul justus et peccator, that we are simultaneously saint and sinner. And he says that Pharisee is in all of us, for good or for bad. Sometimes because of our saintliness, sometimes because we do tithe to our church, and we do fast, and we do pray, and we do things, we do serve, and we do keep the 10 Commandments. I've never killed anyone. But that Pharisee is in all of us, he says. But so is that tax collector sinner in all of us. And we have to recognize that tension. And we probably shouldn't be praying, God, I thank you that I'm not like those other people, not like those tax collectors, not like those sinners. But likewise, we also don't pray like that tax collector who says, God, I thank you that I'm not like that Pharisee. That's just the opposite end, that we have to hold in tension both of those, that this is our life. Lutheran pastor David Lose told 2 stories, one about a young woman who a few years back, Estelle O'Neill, I may be forgetting it, I may be confusing her first name Estelle with Virginia and Alice's aunt, but Asina O'Neill, who was, maybe some of you maybe have heard of her, Asina O'Neill. She had 500,000 followers on Instagram and 200,000 followers on this and that. And she was the queen of social media living in Australia. And she turned 18 and she said, whoa, this has all been kind of a sham. I've been trying to do this and this and this just to get likes, just to get people's attention, just to show how good I am. And she's 18 and she says, this was just a bit of a sham. This is too much. This was judgment by social media. And she was the queen of that social media, at least by her peers. She was like that Pharisee. Or Aaron Rodgers, he plays tonight. Green Bay fans, right? Aaron Rodgers. And 2 hours after winning Super Bowl 45, Aaron Rodgers says, this was amazing. This is fantastic. This is what I've been planning, praying, hoping to do my whole life. And now, is this all there is? There has to be more to life than football or winning the Super Bowl. He was kind of that Pharisee. He's done right in the eyes of football and eyes of the NFL, eyes of the Green Bay Packers, and winning the Super Bowl. And all of a sudden he said, no, wait a minute, there has to be something more. And he said he had to resolve to do a few things differently in life. We hold that tension. We try to do our best. Sometimes we're Pharisees. Sometimes we're tithing. Sometimes we're giving. And sometimes we know that we have completely failed and done the worst possible thing or failed to do. Pharisee and tax collector, Pharisee and sinner, bound together simultaneously, Satan and sinner. So if you're a Pharisee this day, thank you and thanks be to God for you. And God bless you and your continued giving and striving, and yet at the same time, ask God for God's mercy upon you. And if you're a tax collector, if you're a sinner, if you have everybody against you like that sinner tax collector did, I'm glad that you're at St. Mark's today. And I'm glad that you're repenting and asking God for God's mercy. But if you're somewhere in between, join the rest of the crowd. Join the crowd of Lutherans that are simultaneously saint and sinner, simultaneously mindful of God's mercy and God's judgment, God's law and God's grace. God's grace. So, today we're going to bid farewell in just a bit to Judy and Kauko Eero. There is a gentleman from Finland still living who wrote a Luther opera in 2000, and we're going to sing his hymn in just a moment. the name of Tikka, Cairo Tikka, Tikka, wrote this hymn. It's called the Grace Song, at least in our English language. It's called the Grace Song. In Finnish, it's a little bit differently. But it's a grace song. And he talks about himself being pretty much a sinner until he stumbled upon God's grace and then went on to a beautiful career in music. He's become a Pharisee in many ways because he's become a leader of Finnish music, but at the same time, he still holds in tension that sinfulness, and he still thanks God for God's great gift. Let's stand and sing that hymn that ends every line with thanks be to God for God's great gift. Amen.